It happened in a small town that barely made it through the winter. A place where every man carried a gun, and mercy was a luxury no one could afford. She was there that morning, the girl they called Ellie. A laundress, barely 20, thin as a fence post, with hands cracked from soap and frost. She had nothing of her own except a patched shawl and a heart that still remembered kindness. That day, she saw a child on the street, a boy no older than 6, his lips blue, his eyes dim. He'd been begging for bread outside the saloon since dawn. Nobody stopped, nobody cared. Not until Ellie did. She reached into her apron, pulled out a biscuit she'd saved from yesterday's meal, and broke it in half. The boy's small fingers shook when he took it, and he whispered a thank you that sounded more like a prayer. But kindness in that town was a dangerous thing. The shopkeeper saw her. So did the sheriff's wife, the one who said the child belonged to them, the camp of starving migrants up by the ridge. Outsiders, not worth the town's pity. By noon, word spread. By dusk, they dragged Ellie into the street. She stood there, under the orange sky, the wind cutting through her shawl, while people she'd washed clothes for, people who'd smiled at her, now called her names she'd never heard before. Feeding the ridge scum, traitor, harboring thieves. Someone threw a stone, another hit her shoulder. Then came the blows. She didn't scream, she just curled around her ribs, her shawl slipping off, her cheek hitting the dust. The boy she'd helped was gone. Maybe he'd run, maybe he'd been taken. The sheriff spat in the dirt beside her. Next time you feed one of them, you'll hang beside 'em. And that was when a voice broke through the noise. Low, calm. A man's voice that didn't need to be loud to be heard. She won't. The crowd turned. He was standing at the edge of the street, tall, coat torn from travel, dust on his boots, a rifle slung over his shoulder. A stranger, no badge, no name, just eyes that had seen too much and still didn't look away. "She's mine," he said. Nobody moved. The wind paused. Even the sheriff's hand on his gun faltered. There was something in the man's tone, not ownership, not threat, but something heavier. Like a man claiming what the world had forgotten was sacred. Ellie lifted her head, blood at the corner of her mouth, her eyes dazed and terrified. She didn't know him. At least, she didn't think she did. But he walked toward her like he'd been looking for her his whole life.
The wind held its breath that evening. The sun had already slipped behind the hills, leaving only the long shadow of a man standing in the middle of the street. The townsfolk didn't know his name, but they knew what kind he was. You could tell by the way he stood, calm, unshaken, every movement slow like a wolf in the snow. A man who didn't waste words or bullets. He stepped closer to Ellie. Dust rose with each bootfall. The sheriff shifted his weight, unsure whether to draw or to wait. "She's mine," the hunter said again, quieter this time, but it carried like thunder. Ellie blinked through the blur of blood and dirt. She wanted to speak, to tell them she didn't know him, but her voice was trapped somewhere behind the ache in her ribs. The sheriff laughed, a short, mean sound. "Yours, huh? Another drifter claiming what ain't his? You planning to buy her off too?" The hunter didn't answer. He just looked at Ellie. For a heartbeat, something passed between them, a flicker of recognition she couldn't place. His eyes were tired, but not cruel. He took off his coat and laid it over her shoulders. "You've done enough to her," he said, his voice steady. "Now walk away." Someone in the crowd snorted. "She fed one of them ridge rats. You think that's fine? That's how it starts, feeding 'em. Then they come for your cattle, your homes." Before he could finish, the hunter's hand moved, not for his gun, but for the man's wrist. He caught it mid-air, turned it just enough for the bones to make a sound that silenced everyone. "No one," he said softly, "lays another hand on her." The man cried out, stumbling back. The others froze. And just like that, the crowd broke, muttering curses, spitting on the ground, pretending they'd never been part of it. That's how cowards end things. Loud when they're many, quiet when they're wrong. When the last of them drifted away, only the wind stayed. The hunter knelt beside her. "You can stand?" Ellie tried, but her knees buckled. He caught her before she fell. His coat smelled of pine and gunpowder. "I don't know who you are," she whispered. "I do," he said. "That's enough." He led her toward the edge of town, past the saloon, the stables, the church where no one had prayed for years. Every step left a print in the dust that the wind quickly erased. By the time they reached the ridge road, night had fallen. Snow started to drift, small flakes catching in her hair, melting on his hands. They didn't speak until they found an old hunter's shack, half buried under pines. The fire he built was small but steady, just enough to paint her bruised face in trembling light. She sat near the wall, clutching his coat around her shoulders. "You shouldn't have done that," she said finally. "They'll come after you, too." He stirred the fire with a stick. "I've had worse company than cowards with torches." She studied him. The scars on his hands, the faint limp in his walk, the silence that hung between his words. There was something ancient about him, not by age, but by what he'd carried. "Why did you say that? That I was yours?" she asked softly. He looked up, and the light caught his eyes, pale, steady, unreadable. "Because," he said, "once upon a time you were." The room fell still. Ellie's lips parted, confusion swimming in her gaze. "I don't remember you," she murmured. "You wouldn't. It was long before this place, before you were Ellie." She frowned. "That's my name." He shook his head. "No, that's the name they gave you here. You had another, one your mother whispered when she brushed your hair by the river." Her chest tightened. "How do you know that?" He didn't answer, just stared into the fire, as if the flames could tell the rest for him. Outside the snow thickened, soft and silent. The world shrank to the glow of that small fire, the faint sound of her breath, and the memory of a name she hadn't heard in years. Ellie closed her eyes. Beneath the ache and fear, something long buried stirred, a flicker of a place she'd tried to forget, a river, a voice, a promise. When she opened her eyes, the hunter was still watching her, the quiet protector she never asked for, yet somehow had been waiting for all along.
The snow fell harder by dawn. Thick, slow flakes tumbled from a sky the color of pewter, muffling every sound in the forest until even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Ethan packed their few belongings into his saddlebag, a bit of dried meat, a canteen half full, his rifle slung over one shoulder. Ellie sat by the fading fire, her fingers trembling as she tried to lace her boots. Each movement sent pain crawling through her ribs, but she bit it back. She didn't want him to see how weak she still was. "You shouldn't move yet," he said quietly, not looking at her. "And stay here?" she answered. "They'll come by noon, you know that." He did know. Men like the sheriff didn't forgive being shamed in front of a crowd. Pride was their god, and vengeance its sermon. Ethan threw his blanket over the horse's back and turned to her. "Then we ride." She nodded, though her legs trembled when she stood. When he offered his hand, she hesitated, not from fear, but from something else, something that felt like déjà vu, like she had held that hand before, long ago. He helped her mount, then swung up behind her, the saddle creaking beneath their combined weight. The horse shifted restlessly as Ethan took the reins. The forest swallowed them. The land stretched white and endless, pines bending under snow, the air biting their lungs. Every hoofstep cracked through the silence, echoing between the ridges. Ethan kept his eyes forward, scanning the tree line, always listening. Ellie leaned against him, her breath shallow, her fingers clutching the worn leather of the saddle. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice breaking the long hush. "North," he said. "There's an old cabin by the creek. No one will look there." She closed her eyes, the rhythm of the horse lulling her into a half-sleep. But even then her mind wouldn't rest. Faces flashed in her memory, the sheriff's sneer, the mob's laughter, the starving boy she'd tried to save, his hollow eyes, the bread still warm in her hands when they tore her away from him. "You could have left me there," she murmured. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Could have. Why didn't you?" He didn't answer first. The wind carried the scent of pine and iron, the sky stretching wide above them. Finally he said, "Because I once had someone who would have done the same for me." She turned her head slightly. "And did she?" He gave a faint, tired smile. "No, she didn't get the chance." The words hung there, suspended in the cold. Ellie wanted to ask more, but something in his tone told her not to. Instead, she looked down at his hands, steady on the reins, scarred and strong, hands that had lived through too much and yet still knew how to be gentle. By midday, they reached the creek. The water was half frozen, whispering beneath a skin of ice. A small cabin stood nearby, its roof sagging under snow, its chimney broken but standing. Ethan dismounted and helped her down. Her legs nearly gave out, but he caught her again, one arm steadying her waist. "Easy," he said softly. She gave him a faint smile. "You always this kind to strangers?" "Only the ones who feed the hungry," he replied. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and cedar. He lit a small fire, coaxing warmth from the damp wood. Ellie sank onto a fur blanket near the hearth, her body shaking as the heat returned to her fingers. For a long while, neither spoke. The crackling of the fire filled the silence, mingling with the faint howl of the wind outside. Then she said, almost to herself, "That boy, he couldn't have been more than 10. His lips were blue, his hands shaking. They said he was one of them, but he was just a child. How could they not see that?"
Ethan's eyes softened. "They don't see. They judge. It's easier." She looked at him. "And you? Who are you to them?" "A ghost," he said simply. "A man who stopped belonging anywhere." Her breath caught. "Did you really know me before?" He nodded slowly. "You lived near the San Juan River. Your mother kept a garden. You had a little dog, brown, with a torn ear. You'd come down to the river every morning, picking wildflowers, and humming that same tune you still sing at night." Her heart clenched. She hadn't told anyone about the river, or her mother, or the song. How could you remember that?" she whispered. "I didn't forget, because that's where I buried my brother. He died the day your mother gave you her bread. You were 6. You didn't know me then, but I knew what kindness looked like, and it looked like you." The fire crackled between them, light flickering across their faces. For a moment, neither moved. Ellie pressed a trembling hand to her lips, the memories rushing back. The river, her mother's laughter, the boy who never came back from the woods. She realized then that he wasn't a stranger, not really. He was a piece of a life she'd long thought lost, a reminder that even in a cruel world, goodness could take root and wait years to bloom again. Outside, the snow deepened. The air turned heavy, the sky bruised with coming storm. Ethan stepped to the window, scanning the trail. They'll track us soon. Then what? We keep moving. The mountain's safer. No lawmen go that far north. And after? He hesitated, his hand resting on the window frame. After? We see if the world still has room for people like us. She smiled faintly. Broken ones? He turned, and for the first time there was warmth in his eyes. No, ones who still care. They left before dusk. The storm hit as they climbed the ridge, snow whipping against their faces, the wind howling like wolves. The horse struggled through the drifts, each step slower than the last. When the trail vanished, they found shelter beneath an overhang of rock. Ethan tied the horse and spread his blanket on the ground. They huddled close, the cold gnawing through every layer. She pressed her head against his shoulder. You think they'll find us? He looked into the storm. If they do, they'll wish they hadn't. She almost laughed, not from amusement, but from exhaustion, from the strange safety she felt beside him. In the quiet between gusts of wind, she whispered, What was your brother's name? He stared into the dark, the memory flickering like dying firelight. Isaac. He used to say no one should die hungry. She closed her eyes. Then maybe I did do the right thing. You did. You just did it in the wrong town. Snow gathered on the ledge above them, the world reduced to white and silence. Ethan's arm found its way around her shoulders, steady, protective. And for the first time since she'd been dragged into the dirt, Ellie felt something close to peace. She wasn't sure if it was because of him, or because she'd finally stopped running from who she was. Maybe both. When morning came, the storm had passed. The land stretched wide and untouched, the first sunlight glinting off the frozen pines. Ethan rose, brushing snow from his coat. He turned to her, his breath misting in the cold. Ready? I nodded. I don't even know where we're going. Good. Means it can be anywhere. And as they rode into the pale gold of morning, their shadows long across the snow, Ellie looked back one last time. The town was gone, swallowed by distance, by storm, by memory.
By dusk, the storm had cleared. The world glittered under a pale moon, the snow crusted hard as glass. The silence was heavy, too heavy. Ethan could feel it pressing against his ribs like a held breath. They found us, he murmured. Ellie froze where she sat by the fire. How can you tell? He pointed toward the slope below the ridge. In the faint light, shadows moved. 3, maybe 4 riders, cutting across the snow in a slow, deliberate line. They weren't lost men, they were hunting. Ethan rose, pulling his rifle from his scabbard. His voice dropped low, steady. Pack what you can, we ride north, stay close. Ellie's hand shook as she gathered their few things, blanket, flask, the small loaf of bread he'd saved. Her breath came fast, white against the night air. Ethan, they'll kill you if they find you. He glanced back, eyes unreadable. They'll try. They rode hard through the timber. The trees loomed like black columns, the moonlight slicing between them in silver streaks. Snow sprayed from the horse's hooves, the rhythm of its gallop thundering through the frozen ground. Behind them, distant but closing, came the echo of hooves, 4 riders, fast and sure. Ellie clung to Ethan, her fingers gripping his coat. Every turn, every dip in the trail felt like the world teetering on the edge of collapse. "Ethan," she gasped, "who are they?" "Bounty men. They've been after me since Utah Territory." "For what?" He didn't answer right away. The horse leapt a narrow ravine, snow exploding beneath them. He pulled the reins hard, guiding them uphill through the trees. "For killing the wrong man," he finally said. Her breath caught. The wrong man? Sometimes justice looks like the same as revenge, until it's too late to tell them apart. A rifle cracked behind them. The bullet hissed past, splintering bark just above Ellie's head. She flinched, ducking low against him. Ethan cursed under his breath, yanking the horse around a bend. "Down," he barked. "We can't outrun 'em in the open." They slid from the saddle, snow crunching beneath their boots. Ethan led the horse behind a fallen pine and crouched, reloading fast. His movements were sure, practiced. This wasn't the first time he'd been hunted. Ellie huddled beside him, shivering. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Ethan," she whispered, "you don't have to fight for me." He looked at her sharply. "Don't say that. You fed a starving child, and they beat you for it. That's the world we live in. Somebody's got to stand up in it, even if it costs him everything." Before she could reply, another shot rang out, closer this time. The men were circling, fanning through the trees. Ethan peeked around the log, then lifted his rifle and fired once. A cry echoed down the slope. "One down," he muttered. "3 more." Ellie pressed a hand to her mouth. "You'll get killed." "Maybe, but not before they reach you."
The gunfire grew heavier. Snow exploded around them, branches shattering under the bullets. Ethan returned fire with measured precision, each shot deliberate, calm. Ellie watched him in awe, his face lit by the muzzle flash, his jaw set, his movements fluid and certain. He looked like a man born of violence, and yet there was something heartbreakingly gentle in the way he shielded her with his body. When his rifle clicked empty, he didn't curse. He simply set it down, pulled his revolver, and waited. The woods fell silent. Then a voice called out through the darkness, "Ethan Gray, you can't run forever." The name hit Ellie like a stone. Gray, the outlaw who disappeared after the killing of Sheriff McNeil 2 winters ago. She'd heard the stories, the man who'd gunned down a lawman in cold blood, then vanished into the frontier. Her stomach twisted. "Ethan, that's you, isn't it?" He didn't look at her. "Names are heavy things, Ellie. I stopped carrying mine a long time ago." "Tell me the truth," she said, her voice trembling. "Did you kill him?" He exhaled, the sound ragged in the cold. "Yes." She stepped back. "Then why should I trust you?" "Because," he said quietly, eyes meeting hers, "I did it trying to save a child, just like you did." Her breath caught. He went on, voice low, steady. "The sheriff had a boy locked in the barn, said he'd hang him for stealing bread. The boy couldn't have been older than 9. I tried to stop it. The sheriff drew first. He missed. I didn't." Ellie's eyes filled. The story echoed her own so painfully it felt like fate, 2 lives scarred by the same cruelty, crossing years apart on a frozen road. The crunch of boots broke the silence. Ethan's head snapped up. "They're close. Stay behind me." He moved like a shadow, slipping from tree to tree. The first bounty man appeared through the pines, rifle raised. Ethan fired once. The man fell. 2 more advanced, firing wild. Bullets ripped through the air. One grazed Ethan's shoulder. He grunted but didn't slow. Ellie grabbed the fallen rifle beside her and, without thinking, aimed. The recoil nearly knocked her down, but one of the riders dropped, clutching his chest. The last man hesitated, and that hesitation was all Ethan needed. A final shot cracked the stillness. Then, silence. Only the wind remained. When it was over, Ethan leaned against a tree, breathing hard. Blood darkened his coat at the shoulder. Ellie ran to him, dropping to her knees. "You're bleeding," she said, voice shaking. He smiled faintly. "It's not the first time." "You could have let them take you. You could have saved yourself." He shook his head. "No. The day I walked away from what's right, that's the day they really win." She stared at him, this man who'd stepped out of shadow and violence, who carried guilt like a second skin, yet still chose to protect her. For the first time, she realized he wasn't running from his past. He was trying to rewrite it. They buried the bodies at dawn, beneath the trees where the snow lay clean. Ethan's movements were slow, deliberate, his breath visible in the cold air. Ellie helped him, though her hands trembled. When the last mound of snow was smoothed over, they stood side by side, looking down. He said softly, "No one wins out here, Ellie. We just try to lose a little less." She turned to him. "Then maybe we can start losing together." He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, something unguarded flickered in his eyes, a tired kind of hope. "Maybe," he said. That night they didn't build a fire. The smoke would have given them away if more men were coming. They sat close beneath a blanket, the stars sharp above the ridgeline. Ellie rested her head on his shoulder. "You still think the world has room for people like us?" He hesitated, then answered, "I think the world's built by people like us, the ones who break and still keep walking." She didn't seem surprised. Her lips curved in a faint smile. "Then let's keep walking." And in that moment, bruised, bloodied, and half frozen, they both knew they weren't running anymore. They were heading somewhere. Not away from the past, but toward whatever kind of future two wounded souls could build from what was left of it.
The first light of dawn came quietly, bleeding through the pines like a whisper from heaven. Snow still clung to the ground, stained in places where blood had met earth. The forest was hushed, save for the slow, ragged breath of a man who'd seen too much of both life and death. Ethan knelt beside her where the embers of their campfire smoldered low. Her face was pale, but her pulse, thank God, still beat beneath his fingers. He'd carried her through the night, through rivers half frozen and trails cut by wolves until they could no longer hear the posse behind them. Now, beneath the trembling light of morning, the world felt as though it had paused, holding its breath, waiting to see whether mercy still existed. He tore a strip from his coat and wrapped her shoulder, whispering her name, her real name, Lydia. It sounded strange after all these years, but right. She stirred, eyes fluttering open, blue-gray like winter sky after a storm. "You stayed," she murmured, voice weak, fragile as glass. Ethan smiled faintly. That kind of smile only men who have lost everything and somehow found one thing worth saving could wear. "Couldn't leave you again. Not this time." For a moment neither spoke. Smoke from the dying fire curled upward, the air thick with pine and frost. Then she tried to sit up, wincing. "They'll come for you," she whispered. "They won't find us," he said, gazing toward the mountains painted gold by dawn. "Not where we're going." He rose and walked to the edge of the clearing. The land stretched endlessly, untamed,
wild and waiting. A world too big for justice, yet somehow just enough for love. He turned back to her, eyes softer now. I used to think men like me were born to die alone. But then you, feeding that starving kid, even when the world beat you for it, you reminded me what kind of man I wanted to be. Lydia's eyes welled, her voice trembling. You weren't the monster they said you were, Ethan. You were the only one who ever saw me. He knelt beside her again, taking her hand, calloused and cold. Then maybe that's enough. Two broken souls seeing each other clear. Behind them the trail was gone, snow falling fresh, erasing every trace of what had happened. Ahead, only light. He helped her to her feet, steadying her as the sun climbed higher, melting frost from the grass. They walked in silence for a while, footsteps soft, the sound of the forest waking around them. A hawk circled overhead, distant and free. When they reached the ridge, she stopped and looked back, toward the smoke still rising from the town that had nearly destroyed her. "Do you think we'll ever stop running?" she asked. Ethan looked at her, then at the horizon. "Maybe," he said, voice quiet but certain. "Maybe we just start walking towards something worth finding." She smiled faintly, leaning into him as they descended the slope, each step a small defiance against everything that had tried to break them. By the time the sun rose fully, they were just two figures moving across a white meadow, no longer outlaw and saloon girl, no longer hunted or ashamed, just Ethan and Lydia. Two names the world had tried to bury, now breathing again in the morning air. And as the wind swept across the plains, carrying away the last echoes of violence, it left behind only the sound of a new beginning, the rhythm of boots and snow, and the promise of forgiveness carried on the dawn.